Hello, everyone. I extend a warm welcome to everyone present today. The Advanced Study Institute of Asia hosts today's digital workshop on Global AI Index 2023 in collaboration with Tortoise Media. Asia is a center for interdisciplinary research at SGT University, which work at the cross current of socio-economic and geopolitical issues and publishes Decipher, an OSCE newsletter about Asia. The workshop will be conducted by Ms. Serene Cesario, lead researcher, and Mr. Joseph White, senior data scientist from Tortoise Media, and shall be moderated by me. Welcome, Serena and Joseph. We are delighted to be joined by the board members of the Advanced Study Institute of Asia. The session will be chaired by Professor Najeeb Jung, joined by Professor Indu Bhushan. We warmly welcome the Controller General of Designs, Patent and Trademark and the Registrar of GI, Professor Dr. Unnat P. Pandit, the Indian Attaché in Japan, Tokyo. We also welcome Mr. Himanshu Goyal, who works at the intersection of AI research and corporate applications along with the IBM Labs AI team. We have young people from the Principal Scientific Advisory Office to the Government of India, and very importantly, the young professionals from the Indian Intellectual Property Office, the ACIC team, and students from the Faculty of Science and Department of Engineering from the SGT University, joining us via smart classrooms along with researchers and academicians worldwide. Moving forward, the fourth edition of Tortoise Global AI Index was released earlier in June. The index uses a combination of indicators to assess a country's AI capacity. The workshop will broadly cover three topics, starting with an overview of the Global AI Index 2023, followed by a regional focus on Asia and insights into conducting big data-led index projects. We kindly request that if you have any questions, please write them in the chat box. Questions will be taken up towards the end of the workshop to ensure the smooth and successful conduct of the workshop and to avoid any interruptions. We would like to ask all of you to keep your mics off during the duration of the workshop. Serena and Joseph, over to you.
Hi, hello everyone. My name is Serena. Thanks for the introduction. I'm lead researcher here at Tortoise, and I've been working on the Global AI Index for the past year alongside my colleague Joe White.
So hi, yeah, I'm Joe. I'm the senior data scientist at Tortoise, and so yeah, we've been working together on the AI Index. Thanks very much for the introduction. Yeah, this is the fourth iteration. And just sort of recap of the agenda, we'll give an introduction to the index because some of you may not have come across it before. We'll talk a bit about sort of Asia and sort of the pillars within the index, and then we'll talk a bit about sort of our methodology and sort of what we might be sort of, how to do these data projects and what we might be doing next year.
Yeah. So, going down.
There we go. Yeah. Okay.
So as a quick intro, for those of you who are not as familiar with the project, the Global AI Index has been running for 4 iterations, so since 2019. And what it is basically a ranking of 62 different countries based on artificial intelligence capacity. And we can go into what capacity means a little bit later. But essentially, it's a way to measure the level of readiness of these countries when it comes to artificial intelligence growth and development. And we do that by measuring various different things across 111 indicators that we group in 3 different pillars and then 7 different sub-pillars. So the pillars you see here, innovation, implementation, investment, they each have a different weighting. That means that we attribute a different level of kind of relevance and importance to each of them. And in terms of pillars, innovation, we've split in research and development. Research, very quickly, is the level of development of research publication related to AI and the kind of university environment and so on. Development refers to patent development, for example, and innovation in that side of things. Talent is the level of talent. So number of AI data scientists or AI engineers. Operating environment is kind of encompasses everything that can be considered to facilitate AI growth, from, for example, public trust in AI to level of data protection and legislation. Infrastructure includes both basic and kind of more advanced next-gen infrastructure, we call it, like supercomputer capabilities, for example. And then investment is split into government strategy and commercial ecosystem, while government strategy encompasses everything that is part of the government efforts in pushing AI forward. So that would be both having an actual government strategy, but also the level of commitment to government spending towards AI. And commercial is everything that relates to the private sector, so private investment in artificial intelligence, from startup development and so on. So I think, I think just one last thing to add here is that the 111 indicators are a combination of both absolute and relative indicators. So there's some that look at the scale, and we will go into this a little bit later, and other ones that are relative to, for example, the population size of the country or the economy size. So I think we can just quickly...
the ranking table has disappeared, but never mind.
The ranking table disappeared.
Yeah, never mind. Oh,
there it is.
Okay. So just to give a sort of a quick, so basically the top 10 in the index. So it's basically the US is in the top, and the US is sort of dominant across all three of our pillars. And sort of particularly when it comes to things like commercial investment, the US is absolutely sort of, no other country really comes close. And then China is sort of second, and in some areas, China is sort of near parity with the US. So sort of when it comes to sort of like research and stuff, the US, China is not that far behind, but there are other areas sort of like the commercial ecosystem where actually there's still quite a big gap between the US and China. And then third, we have Singapore, which sort of, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in the next few slides, but sort of Singapore is what we call a very small but sort of intense AI country, and it's sort of, it's a population of 5 million, but within that there's sort of a very high sort of per capita concentration of talent and capital and sort of resources. And then we sort of have sort of traditionally we have the UK and Canada in fourth and fifth, and then the other Asian countries sort of represented in the top 10. We have South Korea, we have Middle East, but Israel, and then sort of, I think just for this audience, India currently sits at 14th in the index.
Yeah. And this is just a snapshot of the first time 10 countries in the 2023 iteration of the index. But we thought it would be helpful to show how the top 10 ranking changed over the past two iterations. So you can see here that the US and China maintained first and second place, while the UK dropped to third, and that was mainly due to Singapore's rise. And really what's most impressive here, and you can kind of see it clearly from this image, is how Singapore jumped places from 2020 being 10th to being 6th in 2021, and then now 3rd. So the UK dropped is really mainly due to Singapore's rise, because the score of the UK hasn't really changed that much over the past two iterations. I think we can move to the next one, because we would like to spend a bit of time talking about the kind of new addition that we had this year, which was really giving a stronger focus to intensity versus scale, to really not just always praise China and the US as the biggest, most powerful AI hubs, but also looking at the countries that are maybe smaller, but really, really active and kind of investing a lot in AI.
Yeah. So what we mean by scale intensity is, so in terms of how we measure a country's performance, we sort of take a mixture of, absolute indicators. So that would be sort of like just total numbers, like the number of, data scientists in this country. And then we also take per capita indicators. So, the number of data scientists in this country per capita. And what we do is our index, generally speaking, is weighted sort of around 2/3 of the index is weighted towards per capita, absolute sort of indicators, and then 1/3 of the index is sort of weighted towards per capita indicators. And so that allows for a chance for sort of like smaller countries that do quite well to still perform quite well, rather than having it, if it was purely absolute, then you would just have sort of, it would basically be sort of who's got the biggest population, or sort of who's, the richest country. And the sort of looking at per capita metrics as well, which is what we describe as intensity, versus absolute, which is what we describe as scale, allows us to sort of understand, like, not just sort of how good are these countries at AI, but sort of how comparable are they. So sort of if we look at this sort of in sort of the countries that do best in scale is obviously the US, and you can see they're really sort of, they are sort of completely dominant. And the next one, China, sort of scores 62 relative to the US's 100. Just to say, these circles are sort of scaled. The size of the circle is based on the population. And then if we look at intensity, we can see that sort of Singapore up here, which is small country, does extremely well on intensity, sort of very sort of concentrated levels of capital. And so you have these sort of countries, Singapore, Israel, Switzerland, and Finland are all sort of quite small countries that sort of are quite sort of dynamic AI places, whereas you have sort of India down here. So sort of India still does, relatively well in scale, and is sort of not that far off the UK and sort of Japan, Canada. But intensity, it's a lot lower, which is, partly just sort of India's demographic weight. So that's sort of how we've tried to represent the countries, not just through a single score, but sort of, how good are you population versus sort of your total impact on the global stage. And if hopefully this is going to work, we've tried to split it a little bit into looking more at Asia. So just to say, so what you see if you take a regional focus on Asia is you have the two sort of outliers. So you have Singapore and Israel, which are sort of outliers within their region. So Singapore is very strong, Israel similarly very strong for sort of Western Asia, the Middle East. And then in terms of sort of other regional clusters, you have all the East Asian countries sort of above around sort of 25, sort of 30 in intensity, which means they're all, these are all rich, well-developed countries. So you expect a certain level of concentration. China's quite far away in terms of scale as well, obviously, just because its size, and they're the second biggest player. Something interesting that actually Japan sort of does quite poorly on sort of intensity, given sort of its sort of advanced economy and everything, and sort of does a lot worse than South Korea, for example. And then below that, sort of the next cluster, you have these green countries. So you have Qatar, Saudi Arabia, I think that is Turkey, United Arab Emirates. They're all sort of sitting in a similar space where sort of they're around sort of just above 25 or so. And then below that, you have sort of the Southeast Asian countries, excluding Singapore, so a little bit lower, Indonesia, Vietnam, I think this is Malaysia. And then South Asia, you sort of have it split, where you have India does actually quite well, demographic weight, and actually has quite a strong talent base. But then you have Sri Lanka and Pakistan quite far over there. And Sri Lanka and Pakistan are sort of really towards the bottom of our index, sort of sitting with countries like Nigeria and Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
So that is sort of an overview of sort of the index in general, and hopefully that gives you a sort of introduction. And then we're going to sort of do a bit more of a regional analysis, and also look sort of individually at some of the pillars. So just to say, I think one of the questions that came to us was sort of, how does Asia, I guess, sort of how does Asia differ in its AI compared to the West? And I think when we looked into this, something we realized was that it doesn't necessarily make that much sense to talk about sort of Asia as a coherent block against the West as a coherent block. And actually, if you start doing comparisons, you find that sort of there are more similarities between certain countries in Asia and the West sort of than differences. So to take an example, if you compare the commercial ecosystem in AI between, let's say, two Western countries, the UK and France, and then two Asian countries, Singapore and Japan, you actually find that like the UK and Singapore have a lot more in common between them compared to Japan and France, which also have a lot more in common between them in terms of sort of what sort of AI companies, or sort of the level of foreign investment versus domestic investment. So we've actually decided to sort of split it out into regions, and hopefully that is quite useful. So this just shows what we have here is, so firstly talking about talent. Sorry, if I just do this. And so this is sort of each of these dots is a country, and showing sort of the relative score within the talent pillar, which sort of is one of our 7 components of the main index. So what we see with talent is that India does really, really well. And that is partially demographic weight, but that is also actually India sort of has quite a strong talent base, has a big sort of, IT sector. And actually India sort of, even per capita, sort of performs better than countries like Brazil. So actually this sort of does quite well and sort of punches its weight against sort of other, middle income countries. And then you have, again, Israel and Singapore as the two outliers. And then sort of you have most of the other Southeast Asian and West Asian countries sort of down here. Something that's quite interesting is that East Asia also looks to not do very well on talent. And particularly the Chinese result, which is here, is sort of quite low. We think to a certain extent, this is probably an under measurement. So for talent, one of the things we take is we look at LinkedIn and basically look at sort of the number of data scientists or the number of sort of machine learning engineers. We know that different countries have different levels of LinkedIn usage, and particularly in East Asia, LinkedIn is not hugely popular. Now, we do some statistical modeling to try and account for this, so we don't just take the raw number, because then sort of Japan and China will be absolutely nowhere. But even so, we reckon that we are probably sort of underrepresenting China and Japan a little bit, whereas India sort of has quite high LinkedIn penetration. Something interesting about India is that sort of it has this sort of a lot of data scientists, a lot of AI engineers. Most of those people on LinkedIn, if you look at them, are working for foreign rather than sort of domestic Indian companies. And there's a question of sort of, is this a case of brain drain, or is this actually sort of, even though those people are working for sort of foreign American tech firms now, will they sort of bring their skills back into India and create sort of a more domestically based talent base? So next we have infrastructure. And so this is somewhere where it's sort of, to a certain extent, it's quite closely tied to sort of GDP or GDP per capita rather. So sort of all the East Asian countries do particularly well. Just to say, so infrastructure sort of looks both at sort of more basic levels of infrastructure that's required for AI. So things like sort of internet access or sort of mobile phone penetration, but then also sort of more sort of advanced stuff like sort of chip manufacture or supercomputing capability. And so this is something where sort of East Asia does quite, South Asia is sort of doesn't do as well as, particularly one of the reasons that East Asia does well is sort of the chip making manufacturing is absolutely dominated by East Asia, sort of something like 55% of exports in 2021 were from like Taiwan, China, South Korea alone. And then also actually Southeast Asia is represented sort of to a certain extent in infrastructure. So actually Malaysia also produces quite a significant amount of chips. Actually, we kind of measure the total volume of chip production. Actually, sort of, if you're looking at AI, it's sort of the quality of the chip also makes a big difference. So sort of the really high-end chips that are coming out of Taiwan's TSMC are not necessarily the same as the sort of the chips coming out of Malaysia. And so something we're thinking about is sort of next year, can we sort of measure the quality of chips as well, and sort of the high-end chips that are really required for sort of advanced AI computing. I think that's everything I have to say on infrastructure. Oh, and yes, the other thing was supercomputing, which is, again, sort of supercomputing. If you look at sort of the top supercomputers, the top 500 across the world, it's really dominated by China and the US. So China has sort of 162 of the 500 most powerful supercomputers. Japan has 31, and Korea has 8 of them. And India has right now just 3. And sort of South Asia is sort of particularly sort of when it comes to supercomputing capability under sort of compared to its peers across the rest of Asia and the rest of the world is sort of doesn't do as well. And supercomputing is increasingly as these sort of as AI moves towards these enormous foundation models, which are sort of trained on billions of parameters, having sort of supercomputing capabilities is sort of increasingly important. So the next one is operating environment.
Yeah, so moving on to operating environment, like I mentioned earlier, this is basically trying to make the point that technologies thrive when the wider society approves of them. So that includes, like I said, trust, but also diversity, gender diversity, data protection regulation, and other indicators. As you can see here, countries in Asia altogether tend to rank quite high, and all of the countries are kind of skewed to the right. And also they have relatively high scores. And I think this is interesting, especially at indicators, for example, the import and export of integrated circuits and public trust in AI. When it comes to integrated circuits, they tend to be a proxy measure that looks at basically the level of import and exports of components for computing hardware. So this can maybe lie into the infrastructure as well, but this also kind of signals the potential to deploy products in that are kind of useful in the development of AI. So when we look at this indicator specifically, Taiwan, China, and Singapore are the top three, but there's other countries in Asia like Malaysia, Korea, Vietnam, Japan that are all at the top. So when it comes to public trust in AI, for example, China, Vietnam, and Taiwan are at the top, which means that there is a higher percentage of people in these countries that think of AI as more beneficial than harmful, for example. And also that think that kind of trust AI companies in the same way that they trust other companies. And within the public trust indicator, other countries like Korea, Singapore, and Hong Kong rank really high, also signaling a high level of public trust when it comes to artificial intelligence. And interestingly, the US, for example, ranks second to last, and other EU countries are at the bottom. I think it was France, for example, was probably the last one. And there are obviously various explanations to this. And also, it's important to say that these indicators on trust, we measure through surveys. So we don't actually go and collect the data ourselves, but we rely on other institutions that collect data on a survey-based level. So it's always important to kind of identify the different methodologies and also how reliable they can be. But interestingly, there's other studies that show that in emerging economies like Brazil, India, China, South Africa, and others, the level of public trust seems to be higher. And that, I think, signals, and I mean, this is one of the theories, but it could be that there is a higher optimism when it comes to technology and artificial intelligence in these countries, because there is an attribution of potential for growth and development, which there is less of in countries that are already kind of developed or advanced on economic growth and other metrics. And so other countries in Europe or in like the United States, for example, tend to be more worried about the risks and potentially negative implications of AI. We can move on to the next pillar, which is research.
So research is sort of around research into basically, AI, so AI techniques and sort of the latest cutting edge technologies. And so we look at things like academic papers sort of published on sort of, AI, new AI techniques or new methods. And we look at sort of universities or look at sort of machine learning systems like foundation models that have been developed by different countries. And you'll see this is something that is it's sort of quite squashed towards the left. Sort of most of the scores are in the sort of below 30, apart from Singapore and China. And that's an indication that this indicator is really looking quite a lot sort of cutting edge AI research. And that is something that really is dominated by sort of a few, rich developed countries. So the US, China, the UK to a slightly lesser extent. And if you're not in that sort of club, then actually sort of your contribution to cutting edge research is sort of not really that significant. Most of the sort of cutting edge stuff is really being done sort of in a few countries, really, the US and China. So those are the countries that do quite well. Singapore does primarily well because of sort of its per capita and also because it has two quite good sort of universities. In terms of research output, I mean, China, particularly when it comes to academic papers, sort of completely dominates, sort of publishes nearly double the amount of papers than the US does. India still does quite well in sort of publishing papers, and that's followed by sort of Japan and South Korea. And then again, when it comes to sort of the development of what we call significant machine learning systems, so things like foundation models, again, it is the US and China that dominate. Korea actually also does quite well on this because there are, a few of the big Korean sort of conglomerates, or sort of chaebols as they're called, these sort of big companies like Samsung or sort of South Korea Telecoms are actually sort of involved in developing sort of machine learning models and things like that. And then the other part of research is development. So development sort of looks sort of, I guess, further down the chain. So if research is sort of more abstract research into the techniques, development is sort of the deployment. And so we look primarily at patents, so sort of any patents that is sort of using AI for techniques from different countries. And we also look at the open source development ecosystem for AI. So we're looking sort of primarily at GitHub, which is this platform that developers sort of share their code on. A lot of open source AI work happens on GitHub, where people will sort of write something and they'll upload it to GitHub and other people can sort of download it and use it and contribute. So that's sort of the idea that it's open source. Again, this is kind of squashed towards the bottom, and this is an area in Asia, at least, where sort of China and South Korea are both quite dominant. They publish a huge amount of patents. I mean, China particularly produces huge volume of patents. I know there are some experts on sort of IP here who will know this better than me, but sort of the Chinese system for sort of patents is a little bit different to sort of for the systems in the West, which is why there's such a sort of a high volume. And then sort of these patents are less about sort of developing really cutting edge AI techniques and more using existing AI technologies for sort of various applications, which is an area where sort of South Korea and Japan have always been quite strong at. Again, these sort of big companies are sort of, whether it's Samsung or whether it's Mitsubishi or something, are sort of publishing quite a lot of patents saying we can use this AI technique for this thing and we'd like to patent it. And in terms of development, when it comes to these sort of large AI foundation models, so this is gone a bit of a tangent, but one of the questions that we have put to us sort of before this was basically, so how does the sort of the uneven distribution of benefits from technology disruptions widen sort of global disparities among nations? So sort of, I guess the disparity between sort of rich countries that are advanced in AI and countries that are catching up. Well, in terms of the way that foundation models, so things like, the GPT model behind ChatGPT, or sort of other of these large foundation models that are currently being developed mostly by American and Chinese firms. So you have OpenAI, Google, Meta in America are all sort of giving out. So the GPT model, which is powering ChatGPT, you have sort of Google DeepMind working on their own large language model. Meta are sort of releasing some of their stuff open source. And then in China, you have some of the Chinese big tech firms also developing their own sort of Chinese language models. There's two ways, I suppose, the future of these could go. And one is that they remain sort of primarily closed source. And that means that these models in the future will really be absolutely dominated by these sort of Chinese US tech firms. And that's not a great situation, I think, for sort of other countries. You end up with a situation where sort of, smaller countries in Southeast Asia essentially are going to end up completely dependent on sort of models, maybe in their own languages, from sort of US Chinese tech firms, and they sort of won't have control over them. And so that is something that would, again, widen the sort of technological gap and widen the sort of the power gap between these two countries. The other way it could go is actually sort of there's a lot of open source development on AI foundation models happening right now. And actually there's a sort of an alternative world in the next few years where actually open source becomes the primary way these are developed, in which case actually smaller countries sort of have a shot because they can sort of develop their own models themselves without sort of being reliant on sort of the technological advantage of the big tech firms. But that still requires a lot of compute power, which is currently something that countries, smaller countries in Southeast Asia, Western Asia don't have. So obviously China and the US have loads, and then rich countries like the UK or Japan or South Korea have the capability to sort of, they have the supercomputers to build their own sort of models. The Koreans can build a Korean language model themselves. For smaller countries, they aren't going to be able to do that. And so I think in terms of how they get around that, there needs to be either some sort of pooling of resource where everyone, sort of smaller countries agree that we'll work together, or actually rich countries should really be sort of essentially lending compute power to sort of smaller countries and saying, you can use some of our compute power to train your own language model. which, you know, if people can reach international agreements to do that, I think will be a good move. And then the next one we have is government strategy.
Yeah, so I'll try to be quick because we want to also leave quite a bit of time to questions. But government strategy, obviously, like when we look at the charts, we see that there isn't really a strong regional categorization, but really the countries that tend to do best here are South Korea, China, Singapore, and Japan, which are essentially the countries that are most advanced when it comes to AI development or have started earlier in like pushing AI at the country level. So Singapore here, I guess, is interesting because it was the first country in Southeast Asia to release a government strategy in 2019. And it kind of spearheaded government strategies in AI in the region. Something interesting to say here is also, though, that none of the existing frameworks and government strategies released so far is considered kind of comprehensive enough to include guidelines that are related to responsibility, and none of them are kind of considered advanced in the sense that they account for the potential risk of AI use. And that is something also that we've been thinking about, obviously, because the AI space is moving so quickly. Also at the governance level, we want to not just look at the government strategies released so far, but have a deeper look into how comprehensive these different strategies are. So for the coming iteration, we would like to look at AI responsibility a little bit closer and other metrics too. And yeah, I think this is it from me.
Yeah. And then finally, and I'll just go through this very quickly because I want to leave time for questions. Commercial ecosystem. So this is really about sort of, you know, the AI startup scene in every country. And the US is so dominant in this. It's sort of over 50% of the funding sort of for AI companies went to companies in the US last year. And actually the share of sort of China's share of investment has actually dropped quite a lot since 2017. So sort of nearly sort of halved between 2020 and 2022, because so much more of it is just going into the US. And otherwise, Israel has a very dynamic sort of AI startup scene. Singapore is increasingly becoming like a hub for sort of AI investment. Whereas the other countries here, so sort of places like Japan, South Korea, just slightly less, India is sort of still, they have sort of domestic investment in their own AI companies, but aren't necessarily pulling in huge amounts of sort of foreign investment. And I think that's all I'll say on the commercial stuff. So did we come to the last bit, which is we want to talk a little bit about sort of the methodology of our index and sort of what we might think about looking at next year.
Yes, and just very, very quickly, there is 3 core principles that we look at when we think of the methodology behind this index. They are relevance, relatability, and sizable contribution. And I think, like, first is probably important to say that these all contribute to what we mean when we look at capacity. So AI capacity is essentially a measurement that can incorporate as many of these indicators that we think of when we think of AI growth and AI development. The idea is that an increased capacity equals to increased ability to generate and sustain AI solutions now, but also with a forward-looking plan for the future. I think we can just jump into the relevance principle, just to shorten things up, if you want to.
So yeah, so I guess we have. Well, why don't you quickly do an outline of the guiding?
Yeah. So the relevance is essentially looking at indicators that are relevant to the current times. So they're kind of up to date and reflect the current AI environment. relatability.
So relatability is this idea that the index sort of should use indicators that are sort of transparent and understandable for the wider public. So one of the things about our index is there are loads of sort of statistical indexes available for various different things, energy and sort of technology and things. Quite a lot of these are sort of, they might be proprietary, so they're sort of a service that like a company builds. They don't reveal how it works, the insides, and they sort of sell access to other companies. Tortoise is a newsroom, so we are sort of journalists, and sort of part of the work here is that the index is part of our journalism. So it's got to be transparent. It's sort of, people need to be able to understand actually what's going on. And so what that means is that our indicators are sort of all hopefully understandable. So like the number of supercomputers or the number of data scientists or sort of the level of funding in AI, they're all things that a person can look at, sort of a non-AI person, and think, oh, I understand what is that trying to measure. And that's what we mean by relatability. It really is about sort of transparency and sort of doing this publicly. We make all our indicators sort of available online. Anyone can sort of look into how we've done it, and sort of it's trying to be open about it.
And then sizable contribution is really related to the availability of data. So when we do an index and when we try to measure indicators that rely on really large amounts of data, we want to make sure that the data is kind of representative enough. So yeah, sizable contribution relates to that.
Yeah. And I'll just talk a little bit about sort of some of the things we sort of, in building this index, some of the stuff we have to deal with. So one of the things is, particularly when you're building indexes that measure things across sort of different nations have sort of different quirks about how they report data, or sort of, what, why certain things look like they do. So as an example, the fact that China publishes so many patents or sort of so many academic papers, or the fact that no one on China is really using LinkedIn, which means that sort of those numbers might not be sort of really representative. And when you're measuring across 62 countries, you're always going to find that certain indicators will either over or under sort of represent the real sort of thing you're trying to measure. And there's not a huge amount you can do about that. So the idea is that if you have an index of over 100 indicators, hopefully those sort of things balance each other out. China is represented poorly on LinkedIn, but does very well in other areas, and sort of is overrepresented because sort of patents might be sort of more quantity than quality, and hopefully balances out. But, we do acknowledge that sort of there are also sort of not just sort of random over and under representations, but sort of systematic things. So, language is always an issue. A lot of this stuff is being done in English, which sort of obviously privileges sort of the West, and particularly the sort of the Anglosphere of the US and the UK. And we do try and sort of account for that. We try and use translations to sort of pick up AI in whatever language it's happening. But sort of there are things that probably are being underrepresented. And particularly China is an issue where they are developing their own separate AI ecosystem. And it's increasingly hard to get sort of good comparable data out of China that you can compare with the rest of the world. And the other thing about sort of the sort of particular challenge for the AI index, which is sort of, I think, unique to the AI index, is that the space is so fast moving. So sort of when we started this in 2019, the sort of what AI was fundamentally quite different from what it is today, even in the last 6 months. And so we sort of have to do quite a lot of work every year to look at the index and say, actually, are we still measuring the right stuff? And actually, do we need to start sort of shifting focus and looking at something a bit different? We used to sort of look at like AI leaderboards of how good particular models did on sort of understanding. So someone will make a test and your model would sort of score 75% on how well it performs. We found that AI is developing so fast that someone will release a test, and within about a year, everyone's scoring sort of 95%. And so we have to keep constantly updating things. And so that brings us on to just sort of the final bit, which is what we are thinking about looking at in the future. We haven't really started this process yet, but sort of what we are planning to change for the 2024 update of the index. And just to give a very brief overview, we've only just started to think about it. We would like to do more about foundation models, so sort of these large language or image models. And that really requires looking at the physical infrastructure of countries. So sort of more focus on not just supercomputers, but data centers, or, more detail on the sort of chip manufacturing, not just the volume of sort of integrated circuits, but sort of who's producing the high-end chips like NVIDIA that can sort of power AI. And then you wanted to say a little bit about.
Yeah, and another example of things that we would like to change is on the government strategy. Like I mentioned earlier, we would like to turn that into more of a checklist system. So basically evaluating government strategies not just based on their existence. And another couple of indicators, but really looking at how comprehensive they are, whether they include the budgets, and also trying to have an easier access to government budgets, which seems to be quite hard. So that's also something that we're trying to think about on how to facilitate that, but also looking at the AI responsibility aspect within various government strategies and seeing how different countries account for AI risks. But really here, given all of you and your attendance here and your interest and competence in this, we would like to hear your thoughts on how you suggest we should change or could change this index in the future. And any questions and anything you want to add, that would be super helpful for us as well.
So we'll open it to the floor.
I don't know if there were any questions in the chat in the meantime.
We have one question in the chat by Maria. So she's saying, thank you for the presentation. Where we could find the Tortoise Global AI Index indices by country for previous years.
So if you're doing sort of research, we do make these sort of previous indexes for previous years available. So please do get in touch with us, or if you get in touch with the organizers, and they can forward our details on. We're happy to sort of provide previous ranks for the indexes. Indicators are a little bit difficult because actually we change the index so much every year to keep up to date with the sort of the rate of AI development, that actually sort of we change the methodology quite a bit every year. But
Thank you. Himanshu sir, I think you have one question.
First of all, I wanted to compliment Joseph and your colleague for amazing work. I just want to know how much time you took to put this all together.
So I'd say we spend maybe slightly more time. Basically, I think we maybe spend sort of half the year updating this, and I'd say we spend a lot of time not so much sort of just collecting the data, but actually doing the research. So every year we talk to sort of experts. We have sort of a advisory board of people who are sort of experts in the AI space, and we say, like, what should we be measuring, like what's changed this year that we should be taking into account. And we spend a lot of time sort of updating methodology, and then actually sort of in terms of collecting the public data, a lot of it, which is almost entirely sort of public, we now have a sort of a system in place where we sort of will pull that information together sort of without too much hassle. But every year we add new things. So there's always a bit of a task of like, oh, actually, we now want to collect this stuff from platforms like GitHub. So we need to sort of create some new systems to do that. But I would say we spend more time thinking about the methodology and sort of also how we present it and sort of what we do than sort of necessarily spending too much time sort of just collecting the data, which is something that I've always been working to try and get the amount of time we spend on collecting data down so we can spend more time on sort of the interesting sort of analysis at the end.
Yeah, and just in terms of the process, it's like a review of the methodology, and then there is a data collection phase, and then data analysis phase, and then everything around building the actual index and the website and the launch and so on. So that's kind of the process usually, and within data collection there are some indicators and some pillars, I would say, that require more manual data collection, and that tends to be the most time-consuming part. So for example, looking at the government strategies, that is something that we haven't automated yet maybe.
Yes.
So it really requires going through every country's government strategy and government policy manually, so that requires a bit longer.
Yeah, we are now getting to the point where we are starting to use AI to collect information for the AI.
Just one suggestion, if that's not a lot of work, try and divide India, China, US, when you talk about the talent availability and investments, more from the city's perspective. Then you will get a better deep down for assessment, because if you were to look at Shanghai as a city and Bangalore as a city, or Hyderabad as a city, or California or DC as a city, you probably will get a deeper perspective for a researcher and a future recruiter or a business people who would look at their data and try and really make a decision on if someone has to do an investment or hiring or any kind of real concrete work, because then you will find some hidden gems into what work is going on. So I liked your comment on LinkedIn. That's not at par for every country, because in Japan, China, probably people don't touch it. It's very relevant to English speaking populace. So, so you would see, if you get down to a few cities as an extension, you may find some much materialistic data for people to admire your report further.
Thank you. That's helpful. We'll take that into account.
Yeah.
We've got some questions from the chat. Can you provide examples of how AI research and applications are changing the world based on the findings from the AI index? I'm not sure if I have anything specifically from the AI index, but an obvious example would be the AlphaFold algorithm that was, I think it was developed by Google DeepMind, which is the sort of they've essentially used AI to basically crack a lot of in biomedicine, crack a lot of like protein structured molecules, and it means that they can much more easily develop sort of new medicines. So that's like a really concrete example that I sort of always sort of say this is a good example of like how AI will sort of change the world for the better beyond sort of just sort of automating I don't know, more businessy stuff.
Yeah. And just there's another question here that looks at, do you consider the environmental impact of AI systems and how different countries approach sustainable AI solutions? That's a very good question, and that's something that we are thinking about for the next iteration. When it comes to environmental sustainability for AI, there's two ways of looking at it. One is AI application to improve environmental sustainability, so how to match AI with net zero, and another one is safeguarding from the environmental impact of AI. And I think one way of doing that would be trying to see whether government AI strategies or AI policies have an environmental side and consider environmental sustainability or not. But it would be interesting to be able to, I don't know, track the emissions of AI systems in a country. And that's something that I don't think we're there yet. But yeah, it is definitely something to think about.
Yeah. I mean, one of the interesting things, I suppose, about the index is that we've taken this concept that we just measure capacity and we don't make any sort of judgments as to sort of whether you're doing it sustainably or whether you're doing it ethically. So we don't really include sort of, we've done plenty of research on sort of like ethical, responsible AI development. We don't include that in the index. Almost in a sense, we just say, here are how good these countries are. And sort of, you know, China's very good at it. Whether they're using AI for sort of very authoritarian purposes is sort of, is sort of a little bit outside of the remit of the AI index.
Although we have been having conversations, and there is also an argument that says if you're doing AI responsibly, that will increase capacity, and that kind of should feed into capacity. So these are obviously very, very big questions and very open questions. But yeah, it is something that we're thinking about. I can see another question from the chat that says, in what ways can the index contribute to public awareness and understanding of AI's impact on society and the economy?
Oh, you're
Another
looking at
big
me.
question.
You read it out.
I think really what it does, this index, is if we consider AI as a really, really powerful technology that has all this power that can kind of influence government, society, public sector, and people's existence, really, it is important to understand how that power is distributed across countries and across the world. And really what this index does is trying to contribute to that level of understanding. So it's not really making any arguments and judgment, but it's really just saying this is what's happening here. And then it's kind of up to you to do what you want to do with this analysis. And what we've had a lot of interest from different researchers around the world asking for the data because of their own specific niche research. So I think how this index contributes is just providing a basic first kind of layer of understanding for people to take and then do further analysis on specific things and niches.
And then we have a question here: how is the cultural setup of Asian countries impacting AI usage? So I won't pretend to be sort of an expert on. I'm certainly not sort of a cultural anthropologist or anything. I do think one of the areas is one we talked about, which is trust, which is we generally find that sort of most Asian countries, the level of trust in AI seemed to be sort of, the AI would do sort of good stuff, seemed better. Beyond that, I think sort of every country has its own sort of specific quirks. I don't know if it necessarily makes sense to sort of talk about sort of Asia sort of as a single cultural setup. I can give my experience, which is I'm half Japanese, so I sort of have some familiarity. And I know that, for example, in Japan, one sort of area there is an advantage is sort of the high level of sort of trust in sort of certain things. So it means that sort of they're more likely to sort of, like, if the government is using AI for things, people are more likely to sort of trust it and engage with it. One downside is that sort of specifically Japanese business culture is sort of not super geared towards startups. It's very much sort of big established firms, and sort of if you make a startup and you fail, that's sort of seen as sort of more shameful than if you sort of would do that in America, where it's almost sort of assumed that you make a startup and it fails. And so that has actually been something that has worked against Japan when it's been trying to develop its own AI ecosystem for sort of various cultural reasons.
There was a question on business incubators.
I think I just want to, because we're nearly out of time, let me just have a look at the three questions. Which ones do you want to take?
So
you want to take the business one?
No, I think that's for you. This for you or this for you?
Okay, how can business incubators use this AI index and create policies, platforms? I mean, I think Singapore is probably sort of the best example of they have their sort of regulatory sandbox, right? Which is
yes, that's true. I mean, I don't know. I wouldn't go so far as taking this index to be able to create policies, but a good example of a country that has developed AI significantly and very, very quickly over the past few years is Singapore. And what they've done is trying to create or incentivize AI growth at the government level, but really investing in research and startup creation. So they've put down a lot of different measures to facilitate AI growth. They have a regulatory AI sandbox that is this framework for businesses to develop AI responsibly. And yeah, I'm not sure that this answers your question, because it's not really specific to business incubators, and it's not really even specific to the AI index. But I think how it can help is it can shows what countries are doing. Singapore as an example, which maybe can be seen as a benchmark from other countries' perspectives.
So does the AI index consider the contributions of countries in space technologies? No, it doesn't. Apologies.
We have a question from our Controller General of Patent, Designs and Trademark.
Yeah, Go ahead.
So his question is, do AI index consider the contribution of countries in space technologies?
I think we just answered that one. No, it doesn't.
It doesn't. No.
And it's something that we do want to keep the index quite specific to AI. So sort of at various times we thought about, do we sort of include cybersecurity, sort of things that are related to AI? But I think for us, it's sort of, if we expand it too far, it just becomes an index about how good is your country technologically. And that is not what we're trying to measure. We're just trying to measure specifically artificial intelligence.
And then this last one is, does the index take into account data regarding healthcare and education when examining the data for investment, innovation, and implementation? We no, the short answer is no, but we do have some indicators that are, for example, related to the students' setup. I mean, in the country, not really so much on healthcare.
No, so we don't really do healthcare. We definitely do education, which is we look at sort of so the indicators we have in research is we look at sort of the best computer science universities, which is sort of the US and China again do very well in. The UK also does quite well in, and then actually India I think has one or two sort of the universities within that sort of top 100 ranking. And then we look, and these are more proxy measures. We look at things like just the number of sort of STEM or IT graduates in each country. So we do sort of, education is quite a big part of it in that it's part of the capacity that is used for building AI. I think healthcare is more, we we say that it's almost, if you use AI in healthcare, that is an outcome of AI, but it's not necessarily something that is part of the sort of building capacity to do anything with AI. So that's why we sort of don't look so much at that. We're only really looking at sort of inputs into AI capacity, not necessarily what the AI is being used for, which is a very interesting sort of question of sort of, you could do almost an entirely separate index, which is sort of use of AI in those countries, as opposed to sort of the ability of those countries to sort of use AI for whatever means they want to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just a final one, because I'm aware we're out of time. Does the index consider AI threats and AI responsibility and risks more generally? Not so much now, and that's something that we are considering for the next iterations. But like we said earlier, it's a bit difficult to kind of make that judgment whether we go further from just AI capacity and include responsibility. So I think that could be something that we maybe keep for the analysis bit, which we do already have some of you, and you can go on our website and look at the different outcomes in terms of articles and reports that we have as a result of the index. But we don't include any of that in the actual measurements so far.
And similarly, just to answer that last question.
Just sorry to intervene again. So good afternoon, Professor Unnata. Hope you're okay. So there is another question from Professor. Yeah. So how is AI index deal with the copyright violations?
That's not something we look at either, actually.
Yeah.
And we do look at patents. We don't look at, I know that this is something that is, are we talking about sort of the use of, is this about sort of generative AI and copyright patents in terms of like the way that there has now been a few legal...
Why I am saying that, see, each technology intervention has a two side. One is a positive side of development, and the other side is the challenges which is attached with the technological advancement.
Mm-hmm.
So for any index, if we consider only singular mode of development, then I believe that, and based on my limited understanding, it is not as a CG I am making any statement into this public forum, but based on my limited understanding, that we are not doing a proper justice. Because for index, we should be considering both the aspect, development aspect and challenges aspect.
Mm-hmm.
Because both are a part of the entire journey of the AI intervention in a various sectors, various domain. And the plugin which is required, like the one is the technological advancement, the second is the technology adaptation, and the third is utilization of this technology on a maybe social front, commercial front. All these are the various aspects. If we are not considering both the side, the opportunity side where the technology intervention has played a significant role, and the challenges side, which is again the offering from the AI, offering of the AI, then we may not be doing a justice. And I would appreciate if we have the negative aspect also, maybe hypothetically designed, developed and studied for the academic purpose, may not be adopted directly, but equally this negative aspect demands the research on this. And being the IP innovation and the economists need to study this negative aspect also, because this is a serious threat on which many countries have limited themselves from officially recognizing the AI content for the protection. And many authors, or I should say that many Hollywood, Bollywood celebrities are also expressing their concerns that, or writers expressing their concerns that their style of writing is adopted by the AI and they are creating some hypothetical creation on their name.
Yeah,
One such case which was reported in USA, that entire case briefing for a legal case was prepared by AI, and majority of a citation were fake. It was created a fake citation. And when it was verified, this puts a serious threat. AI is good if it is properly utilized for giving the desired output.
Yeah.
But this output is no one has expected. So it demands to have a balanced study. That's what is my personal submission. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks so much for that. I think.
Thank you for that, sir. Thank you for your comments. Yes, sir. Yes,
Yeah,
Elina.
just very, very quickly. I think thanks for the comment, Professor. I think your comment really feeds into both the two main things. One is AI responsibility, and that is something that we're thinking about including more of in the next iterations, and trying to figure out how we can do that in a way that still makes sense in an index form, and also how to include more of generative AI, which is really what is driving most of the concerns right now as well, in terms of lack of regulation. And Joe has talked a bit about how we are thinking about doing that. These are both two things that we are definitely thinking about as improvements for next year. So thanks for raising them.
Joseph, if I can just butt in to Professor Unnit's as a rejoinder. So I think what he's leading us to is talking about the governance part of the AI when you do these models and all. And I'm extremely happy to introduce you to some of the work we are doing at IBM around this governance piece. So I'll request Amogh to connect us, and we'll be very happy to fill you on that. And also, I'll get back to Professor Unnit on what we are doing.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you.
Yes, please. And I think it would be really helpful to also have another conversation as we move into thinking about the methodology changes for next year. It would be great to include you in the conversations with experts that we will have. So for sure. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Himanshu sir. Thank you, Professor Unnat sir. I would now request Amogh sir, Director Research Asia. I think he has one question. Yes, so please. So you are on mute.
You are mute.
Yeah.
Right. It's very hard to get economists to shut up unless we are muted. So thank you for the presentation, and thank you for your time today. I had a lot of questions which I will not be able to ask you, so perhaps we'll do it sometime else. I have a quick comment that has come to me from my friend, who is one of our science diplomats stationed abroad, and he's an engineer. His comment is, what are the biases that are inherent in the AI index, especially from the point of view of generative or foundational models, that the Tortoise Media organization is going to be incorporating for the next batch, next year? Like, how do you reduce biases inherent in data?
So you mean the biases of sort of over-representing certain countries against other countries?
Over-representation, under-representation of the numerical side, but also, are there not some qualitative biases that kind of make themselves over into the models themselves for AI?
So I think there's, in terms of sort of measurement for the index, I think it's just making sure that if we're looking at sort of generative AI models, we're making sure we are taking them sort of from everywhere, and sort of making sure that we're sort of looking at ones across different languages. I think in the question of sort of biases within these models, so sort of the fact that if these models are, as an example, I think we're talking about sort of if a model is trained by an American company, it is likely to sort of incorporate sort of American cultural biases into the sort of the output of that model. I mean, that is not something that sort of, again, this index is really about sort of measuring capacity. So it's not something we're sort of directly looking at sort of measuring in a qualitative sort of way, sort of quantitative way within the sort of the index ranks. But it is something that we are looking at each year when we do sort of our new index. We also do sort of a bit of we do analysis, we do presentation. Actually, because we're a newsroom, we sort of write we do reporting on it. And so that is something sort of looking into the biases of sort of cultural biases within language models and sort of how they might be overrepresentative of like rich developed countries that make them is something that sort of feeds more into our reporting than it does necessarily into the index. So hopefully we're hoping to write about it, but it might not be something that sort of can be built into the ranks of the index itself.
Right. I think at Asia, we can propose to have an Asia-centric analysis whenever you're ready with the next one. So that, because we are concerned in the geopolitical implication of AI models, but also, I think, equality. For example, an AI model which is used to give medicinal advice, right? So if you get the advice for an ideal body type, which is trained on the Western body, as compared to the Eastern body type, it might lead to a whole lot of negative medicinal outcomes. But anyway, I think we are short of time, and this is a conversation that can go ad nauseum.
Yeah, if you did have any more questions, please do email them to us, and we're happy to take a look at them afterwards.
I've just popped this email address into the chat. So if anyone has any more questions, feel free to email us at aindex@tortoisemedia.com. We always get a lot of questions, so we're always happy to engage with the audience on anything. So please do reach out to us.
Thank you, Serena, for the email ID and for all the relevant information. So in the last, I would request our Vice Chairman, Indu Bhushan, Professor Indu Bhushan, who's also a health economist, to say the last words. Indu sir.
Thank you for inviting me. And I must admit that the topic was actually beyond my level of comprehension. So I did did benefit from this, but maybe not aligned to what my background skills and knowledge level is. But I really want to thank you, Joseph and team, for taking out time and sharing your thoughts with all of us and a large number of students who are part of this session today. And thank you, Amogh, for organizing it and inviting us.
Thank you very much for inviting us. Yeah, it was a real pleasure to talk to you, and please do keep your eyes peeled for the next iteration of the index in 2024.
Yeah. Thank you everyone for the workshop. Thank you Manshu sir, thank you Unnat sir, thank you Amogh sir, and everyone, students and my colleague from Asia. And thank you so much, Joseph and Serena, for coming here and delivering the presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Have a good day.